Uachtarán cathaoirleach cód lacaithe agus cóide tá áthas orm bheith anseo aniu leatsa ceiliúradh Organ a Institute. Faoi an chéad leabhar béarla cnábhseachas san Éireann. Do you need a translator for the rest? No. President, Chairman, Fellows and Members and Associates and guests, I'm delighted to be with you at the golden anniversary of the Institute of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And thank you indeed for this opportunity to present some highlights of the rare book, James Wolveridge's Speculum, Matricis of 1670, which was Ireland's first book on midwifery published in English. I first came across the reference to the Speculum Matricis over 30 years ago in Harvey Graham's Eternal Leave, which was an in-depth study of the history of obstetrics and gynecology, and later in John Fleetwood's History of Medicine, in which he stated that the book was a forerunner of the popular Catechism series of such publications. The Speculum Matricis is without doubt a remarkable volume, and in the early 1990s, on a visit here to number 6 Kildare Street, the librarian Robert Mills probably told me that there was a copy in the RCPI. A reading of this manual really inflamed me with enthusiasm, so I returned with a tape recorder, multiple tapes, dictated the text, and sketched the many illustrations in the manual. I presented some of the details of the contained materia medica to UCG's 150th celebrations in '95. Then in 2013, the Speculum Matricis came to mind once more, and in idle moments I started to look through the internet. According to the English physician historian James Hobson Aveling, the Speculum Matricis was the earliest original work on midwifery in the English language. But the London physician historian Herbert Ritchie Spencer wrote a negative review citing plagiarism, and this heavily influenced subsequent authors. Over the decades, it became a truism. But I had dictated the Speculum Matricis over many days, checked the typed, searchable script line by line, and over the years had saved the text on a variety of hard disks, floppy disks, USB sticks, and converted the lot to Office Word. From memory, I thought Wolveridge had cited several authors, including Hippocrates, as shown on the page from the manual. He also cited William Harvey. It seemed unlikely, but could Spencer's judgment be flawed? Just then, in an episode of synchronicity, the Latin goddess Fortuna intervened, and the Speculum Matricis became available as a printed copy via early English books online. I approached my alma mater in Galway and requested academic oversight of a modern interpretation of Ireland's first book on midwifery in English. Some months later, my hypothesis developed, namely Wolveridge's Speculum Matricis, a mirror on antiquity, ? So it was important to try and find out where did this manual fit within the history of midwifery, medicine, and therapeutics. Some elements of my research are shown here. Important to relate that midwifery texts and the history of midwifery were written by men, in the main, until recently. And the voices of midwives and mothers do not feature to any great extent in the era under study. Hippocrates, whose mother was a midwife, detailed his involvement with pregnancy, notably in descriptions of severe maternal illness and mortality, and in his aphorisms. Aristotle added tracts on reproduction and embryology. Greek midwifery was also heavily reliant on Herophilus, particularly his text on difficult labor and the anatomy of the fetus, later copied by Galen. Cyrannus of Ephesus in the 1st century AD wrote a practical book on midwifery and therapeutics for physicians, quoted his predecessors, and availed of his own personal practical experience. He wrote a shorter midwife catechism, It is evident that midwives and physicians from the earliest times had an interest in female conditions. Galen didn't write much about pregnancy. He was more into the medicine and the complex therapeutics, and his form of medicine became the dominant medical system and survived on university curricula right through the 18th century. Theophrastus in the 4th century BC explored plants as remedies in his Historia Plantarum, and similarly minerals in his text on stones. Along with Dioscorides of the 1st century AD, his text De Materia Medica, these were major influences on remedies used in midwifery, the development of therapeutics, the apothecaries trade, the great herbals, and eventually, of course, the pharmacopoeia. And these are just some Latin excerpts. Agnodice was a Greek midwife who dressed as a man to learn about medicine. And her story became very important in the 16th century. It became an essential feature in the debate about women's roles in midwifery and medicine. But whether she existed is open to question. Obstetrics was the term for a midwife until Anglo-Saxon times. Another Greek female physician, gynecologist, and midwife, Cleopatra Metrodora, was the first woman in antiquity to write a treatise on gynecology whose title was On the Diseases and Cures of Women. At the close of the 12th century, a text on women's medicine in 3 parts became known as the Trotula, written in Salerno. The Trotula was named after a local female physician, Trota or Trocta, and that title carried through to the Liber Troctularis, a manuscript of the early 15th century, which was the first text on gynecology in English. The Benedictine nun, Hildegard of Bingen, also was interested in plants and remedies and wrote not only on music and church music, but about menstruation, conception, pregnancy, and breastfeeding. But her writings in general weren't very useful for midwives. With regards to transmission and reception, the ancient remedies known from Egypt and Mesopotamia funneled, as it were, through Greece and then found their way around the Mediterranean littoral to North Africa through Byzantium and eventually across to Italy. And in Salerno in the 12th century, these texts were translated to Latin and found their way to the rest of Europe. There was a revival of Greek language in the West in the 15th century, and this meant that original works could be accessed, thereby bypassing many of the Arabic and Latin translations, which were to some extent altered by the addition and commentary of their translators. Wolveridge, writing in the 17th century, was surely influenced by what was termed the medical and scientific revolution of the era. Paracelsus railed against the ancients except Theophrastus, whose name he used in his own writings. In Basel, he burned the works of Galen and introduced chemical therapeutics and ingredients such as mercury and sulfur, and he popularized laudanum, which had opium. Andreas Vesalius highlighted the errors perpetuated in Galenic anatomy, but introduced others, particularly to women's and reproductive anatomy. William Harvey, of course, described the circulation of the blood, but also wrote important tracts on reproduction and gained for him the title, because of that, of the father of British midwifery. And he accurately described the fetal circulation as well. Meanwhile, in continental Europe, licensing of midwives began about 1452 in Regensburg. Then proposals for the instruction and licensing of midwives in England began in 1547. But midwives remained under the control of the local bishops until 1642, when the licensing transferred to the physicians and surgeons at Surgeons' Hall in London. Paris led the way in midwifery education, and female students were admitted to the Hôtel Dieu for instruction from at least the 1630s. In Ireland, the regulation of midwives passed to the King and Queen's College of Physicians, ourselves, in 1696. Meanwhile, man midwifery became an important issue. Midwives were present at childbirth in Greece, and physicians were called in for complicated cases. And this model of care was replicated over the centuries. In the late 13th century, for instance, the treatment of gynecological conditions was a fundamental part of the medical care of North Italian male physicians. In the 16th century, the German surgeon William Fabry, whose wife was a midwife, described how he conducted complex cases of childbirth. Surgeons served an apprenticeship in which manual interventions were to the fore, so they were likely to become involved in midwifery maneuvers. This was very much in evidence in France, with the surgeon accoucheurs Ambroise Paré, Jacques Guillemot, François Morisot, and those who followed. And of course, in England, in the 1630s, in particular, the Chamberlain family introduced not only the forceps, but spoke on behalf of midwives and their education. The forceps didn't come into use for a further 100 years. Percival Willoughby, a contemporary of Wolveridge, whom he also cited along with his friend William Harvey, may have been the first full-time man midwife in England. The topic of man midwifery was also raised in the Speculum Matricis. An appreciation of the growth of midwifery manuals is helpful at this stage. Soranus, whom we had met before, the midwifery and medicine of Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Hierophilus came through in his Gynecia, along with his own practical insights. His treatise could be viewed as the first of its type, later to give rise to midwifery manuals. His text was translated to Latin by Moschio in North Africa in the 5th century AD, and then found its way into medical manuscripts, as shown in this 9th century version from Brussels. And his writings can be followed all the way through in manuscripts to the advent of printing at the end of the 15th century, and of course had an enormous influence. The first printed version of a midwifery manual was Der Rosegarten in 1513. This was authored by Eucharius Roslin, who was an apothecary at Freiburg, and he later became a physician at Frankfurt and Worms. Now, he was responsible for examining and supervising midwives. And Roslin is shown here presenting his treatise to his patron, Catherine of Pomerania. This was later translated to English as The Birth of Mankind. And this was the first major work on obstetrics in 1500 years, being mainly reliant on Soranus. It was written for the education of midwives, as were all subsequent manuals in the vernacular. The treatises for physicians were in Latin, which was the universal language of medicine in the West. Soon followed Jacob Ruve's De Conceptu, which was printed simultaneously in German and Latin, and would become the expert midwife some 33 years prior to Wolveridge's Speculum Matricus of 1670. Ruve also derived much from Soranus, but he included the first ever illustrations of embryology. A scientific approach to midwifery came in the 16th and 17th centuries through Paris. Ambroise Paré introduced new methods of breech birth. Louise Bourgeot became the first woman to write on midwifery, and she was the royal midwife of France. Then we have the translations of Jacques Guillemot, which added significantly, adding details from practical experience. Some midwifery manuals were translated to English by Nicholas Culpeper, who classified himself as an apothecary, and others. So Wolveridge's intellectual development, of course, was of prime importance in writing the Speculum Matricis. As published in the Alumni Dublinenses, Wolveridge graduated as a physician from Trinity in 1664 summer. Tracing backwards through the required years, 14 years of study, leading to the award of an MD, he had matriculated about 1650, at the usual age of 16. A review of the Trinity admissions books reveals a chasm, you can see it faintly at the top, between 1644 and 1652 due to the political unrest. On the right, we see the name under tutor Stern. So tutor Stern, 1652, Wolveridge possibly joined in 1650, but Wolveridge's name does not appear anywhere in the admissions book. The founder of our college, later Sir John Stern, was Regius Professor of Physics at the time that Wolveridge graduated MD. So the men were known to each other, but the relationship was not mentioned by either. Regarding education, the Caroline Oxford University statutes were set down by Archbishop William Laud in 1636 and adopted by Trinity College. He later lost his head, of course. The curriculum for an aspiring physician included 7 years of classical education to reach MA, followed by a further 7 devoted to Galenic medicine and therapeutics. The Speculum Matricis has 221 pages, of which 55 were prefatory and a further 166 were substantive, with 35 chapters devoted to pregnancy, childbirth, puerperium, and related ailments, and much information can be gleaned from those prefatory pages. For instance, the frontispiece of the Speculum Matricis of 1670, shown on the left of the slide, written in Cork, published in London, was followed with a change of title the following year to Speculum Matricis, or the Expert Midwife. But the content of the manual did not change. It's possible that the Hibernicum in the title represented the English perception of the boggy Irish and inhibited sales in England. We can see that the source of the Expert Midwife in Wolveridge's 1671 manual would seem to relate back to Jacob Roof, Expert Midwife, 1637. Speculum titles were very common between the 12th and 16th centuries, and you have a group of very famous ones here. Study of the Speculum Historiale by Vincent of Beauvais reveals the etymology. In the background, we can see a mirror. A mirror was a speculum. Matrix was a term used for the uterus in antiquity and now taken over in mathematics and science. This was the first illustration of the matrix in a manuscript, copied from the 5th century Moschio text, in turn derived from the 1st century AD from Soranus. And we can see the word matrix arrowed there. With regards to the midwifery portion of the book, well, the initial midwives that we know most about were Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives from Exodus. And what used to happen was they were assisted by handmaids. There were 3 in number usually, 1 supporting from the rear and 1 from each side. So thus, Wolveridge had said his book was also a handmaid, a pocketbook to bring along to childbirth. And we can see midwives and their handmaids shown at the birth of Cleopatra. Although written in Cork, we can see that Wolveridge actually says the kingdom of his nativity was England. In this illustration from the manual, Wolveridge, in the guise of a Dr. Philadelphos, discusses pregnancy with a midwife termed Eutrapelia and a pregnant mum. And what's very important is that the book was written in ordinary, plain English and was written with great respect for midwives and for women. He wanted the book to be accessible to all women who could read the purpose was to educate, rather than being a tome for medical men. Now, the word Philadelphus relates back to Ptolemy II and his sister Arsinoe, who were co-regents of Greek Alexandria in Egypt, which was noted for its scholarship. And Eutropelia reflects Aristotle's golden mean, a reliable person. There were 33 illustrations in the book, and the engraver was the well-known Thomas Cross from London. Of those 33 illustrations, I classified 18 as birth figures, and this sequence displays male infants in a layered uteri in Wolveridge, apparently derived from Ruth, and then Ruth had derived it from a simpler flask shape of Rosalind's. When we look at the bottom figure taken from the Vesalius, we see that errors crept into the system, and this is what I mentioned earlier on. In the bottom graphic there, you can see, number one, that there's a band, a placental band, which is not present in humans and comes from canine anatomy, and also carried in Wolveridge and Ruth, taken from Vesalius, we can see that a ureter enters the upper vagina. Rosalind had adapted his figures from manuscript sources, and here we can follow from the 15th century all the way back to the 5th century. And there are many more images. These are just a few to relate the tale to us. But a set of birth figures evolved in antiquity and were reproduced in manuscripts and later in midwifery manuals to the late 17th century. In summary, we can look at the names from whom those illustrations derived. Two were original to Wolveridge. William Fabry and Thomas Bartholin were cited for 3, and then there was no citation at all for 28, 26 of whom looked like they were taken from Ruth, a further one from Pino, and another from Casserius. There is a comprehensive materia medica in the Speculum Matricis, mainly in the second half of the manual. And in this miscellany of medicines, he deals first with diet and lifestyle as a method of treating complaints. There were 221 ingredients named, sometimes in English, sometimes in Latin, sometimes with alternate names, sometimes difficult to figure out what they were. But then there were compound medications in the galenic mode, methods of application 48, the weights and measures were given very succinctly, and what treatments should be avoided. There was only one compound that was mentioned for a lady's name, which was the Countess ointment. And I was able to trace that back to a Countess de Vadra in northern Italy in the 14th century. It was given to her by her local physician so that she wouldn't have a miscarriage. Here we can see an example of one of his compound prescriptions. You can imagine you would have to have the book in your pocket if you were to remember how to put together this prescription. And this is in, again, the Galenic mode. Pre-Galen prescriptions were very short. Hippocrates didn't really have a lot to do with medications. Regarding the provenance of the materia medica, it can be traced quite easily in 67% to the works of Dioscorides and some to Theophrastus. The otherwise group there relates to other Greek sources, sources from Byzantium, and a few from Arabic sources. Then gradually medicines came in through the 15th through 17th century, mainly from this part of Northern Europe. The Castile soap and Irish slat were the first names that I saw in a midwifery manual. Up to Wolveridge's time, they weren't mentioned anywhere else. Within that area of medications, he cited 4 very important works. I have highlighted the Rodrigo de Castro one because this is an enormous midwifery book in Latin, a very important book that I think had a lot to do how Wolveridge framed his own book. Now, Rodrigo de Castro was a Portuguese converso who went to Germany, and his wife died in childbirth, and this triggered him to write this book. With regards to the midwifery, well, the midwifery portion is presented in a catechism form with the expert midwife, Eutropelia, and she responds to questions from Dr. Philadelphus. In summary, it was original work. It was not a translation of another text. Philadelphus and Eutropelia were very innovative. It was in English, so therefore available to anybody who could read, but imitative of antiquity and Saranic areas. But it was derived from contemporary sources. You can see sources that he mentioned here for midwifery, ancient and recent. The ones in the parentheses, the brackets, are ones that he didn't refer to, although he used their texts. So what about Herbert Spencer, who said that the Speculum Matricus was sheer plagiarism? Well, the first thing to understand is that plagiarism did not exist in his time. It was a practical thing to take from another book illustrations or words, and it was part of publishing etiquette. The whole idea of plagiarism only started to take off in the 18th century, which was, of course, after his time. Apart from that, Wolveridge had lots of citations. He had 12 from antiquity, he had 8 from recent times, and then I picked up on 5 that he definitely took, extracted from, but never mentioned. Some 12 years after his book was published, another version came out, was called the English Midwife, and it was published by his publisher, Roland Reynolds, and also another publisher, Sawbridge, who had done some of the works of the apothecary I mentioned earlier on, whose name has gone out of my head. Anyway, this probably indicated that James Wolveridge had become deceased at this time. We know that Wolveridge lived in Cork. He married a lady from the south of Ireland. He had a son. Outside of that, there is no record. So what about my original question, James Wolveridge's Speculum Matricus, a mirror on antiquity? Well, the answer is yes, it was a mirror on antiquity. So farewell from my study in Cork. Thank you very much.